This is BBC One. Now at 6 o'clock, the BBC News with George Alagaya.
Today at 6, the Prime Minister's authority is draining away. Resignations from government and a loss of support among his backbenchers too. Just some of the Tory ministers and aides have sent in letters of resignation, 36 and counting.
Is the government collapsing, Mr. Shah?
In the last hour, cabinet ministers have been streaming into number 10. They have one message for Boris Johnson: it's time to go. It follows a devastating speech from the former health secretary.
We have reason to question the truth and integrity of what we've all been told. And at some point, we have to conclude that enough is enough. I believe that point is now.
Will you be Prime Minister tomorrow? Of course.
More Westminster hostility from senior MPs this afternoon, but through it all, the Prime Minister insists he's here to stay.
Frankly, Mr. Speaker, the job of a Prime Minister in difficult circumstances when he's been handed a colossal mandate is to keep going, and that's what I'm going to do.
Tonight, the end appears nigh for Boris Johnson. It feels like a question of when, not if, he'll go.
So, political turmoil in Westminster will bring you the latest in a fast-moving story and hear what voters think of it all. Also tonight, a Ukrainian mother picks through the remnants of her beloved son's life. Our special report on Russian atrocities and a war crimes investigation. The Lionesses training at Old Trafford. In less than 2 hours, they'll be in action. The Women's Euros underway today.
And stay with us on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Hello and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. As we go on air this evening, a number of cabinet ministers are in number 10 and they have one message from the Prime Minister: it is time to go. At least 36 ministers and aides have said they can no longer serve under Boris Johnson. It follows a devastating resignation statement this afternoon from the former Health Secretary Sajid Javid. He told a packed House of Commons that he quit yesterday, along with former Chancellor Rishi Sunak, because he no longer thought it was possible to hang on to his own integrity while remaining loyal to the Prime Minister. Enough is enough, he said. All day, Conservative backbenchers have been withdrawing their support too. Despite all this, the Prime Minister insists he's here to stay. Rarely has Westminster seen a day when the authority of a Prime Minister has been undermined in this way. Let's turn to our political editor, Chris Mason. Chris.
George, at lunchtime today, I sat in the press gallery for Prime Minister's questions, and you could hear the authority and power of Boris Johnson draining away moment by moment. In the hours afterwards, even his most loyal supporters were privately saying the game was up. It was time for him to go. And as you were saying, in the last hour or so, a delegation of cabinet ministers, one by one, heading into Downing Street to say that Boris Johnson must resign. Today has felt like the most pivotal day yet in the downfall of Boris Johnson. The front pages, the photographers, the reporters, all asking the same thing.
Is it all over, Prime Minister?
The lenses tilt towards Boris Johnson leaving Downing Street, heading for Parliament at lunchtime, and Prime Minister's questions. The difficult questions usually come from the opposition benches. Today, they came from Conservative MPs as well.
The Prime Minister constantly tries to deflect from the issue, always tries to blame other people for mistakes, and that at least nothing left for him to do other than to take responsibility and resign.
Today I ask him to do the honourable thing, to put the interests of the nation before his own interests, and before, in his own words, it does become impossible for government to do his job.
Does the Prime Minister think there are any circumstances in which he should resign?
Frankly, Mr. Speaker, the job of a Prime Minister in difficult circumstances when he's been handed a colossal mandate is to keep going, and that's what I'm going to do.
And when it was the Labour leader's turn, he took aim at those in the Cabinet.
Only in office, because no one else is prepared to debase themselves any longer, the charge of the lightweight brigade. Have some self-respect. In the middle of a crisis, doesn't the country deserve better than a Z-list cast of nodding dogs?
Mr. Speaker, the difference between this government and that opposition is we have a plan and they do not. We're getting on with it. They want to focus on this type of issue, Mr. Speaker. We're going to get on with our jobs.
Ian Blackford.
The Scottish National Party leader at Westminster is often remorselessly barracked by Conservative MPs. Not today.
Let's face it, it's a minor miracle that the Prime Minister has even made it through to Prime Minister's questions, and he really ought to see the faces behind him, because, Prime Minister, it really is over. The Prime Minister is desperately clinging on to his own fantasy, but the public can't afford to put up with this farce of a government a minute longer.
All day, it felt at times like every 10 minutes or so, Conservative MPs were sending letters saying the Prime Minister should go. And just take a look at the language chosen by the now former Justice Minister Victoria Atkins as she resigned. Values such as integrity, decency, respect and professionalism should matter to us all. I have watched with growing concern as those values have fractured under your leadership. I can no longer pirouette around our fractured values.
Are we witnessing the collapse of the government, Mr. Javid?
And from a letter to a resignation statement from the man who just yesterday was Boris Johnson's health secretary.
I call Sajid Javid.
Have a look at the body language of the Conservative benches as you listen to Mr. Javid's words.
Treading the tightrope between loyalty and integrity has become impossible in recent months. And, Mr. Speaker, I will never risk losing my integrity. And now this week again, we have reason to question the truth and integrity of what we've all been told. And at some point, we have to conclude that enough is enough. I believe that point is now.
He said he had been patient, hoping things would improve.
But I do fear that the reset button can only work so many times. There's only so many times you can turn that machine on and off before you realise that something is fundamentally wrong.
And then there was this, a public, laser-guided attack on those still in Boris Johnson's cabinet.
They will have their own reasons. But it is a choice. I know just how difficult that choice is. But let's be clear. Not doing something is an active decision. I am deeply concerned about how the next generation will see the Conservative Party on our current course.
Can I say to the House, there will be no more personal statements today.
Tonight, the Prime Minister's most senior colleagues are telling him his time is up. Firstly, it was the Community Secretary, Michael Gove.
Is the government collapsing, Mr. Shapps?
Then, in the last hour, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. Plenty more are doing the same.
Prime Minister, how's your week going?
Terrific.
But Mr. Johnson faced another interrogation first, the liaison committee of senior backbenchers, who were keeping up with the news.
It's being reported that there's a delegation of your cabinet colleagues waiting in Downing Street, including the Chief Whip, the Transport Secretary and your new Chancellor, waiting to tell you when you finish here today that it's time for you to go. How will you respond to that?
You're asking me to comment on...
This conversation will happen in a few minutes, Prime Minister.
If so, you say. But I'm not going to give a running commentary on political events. We're going to get on with the government of the country.
This is a postcode defined by power. And tonight, it is shifting. The end of Boris Johnson's premiership appears imminent. Chris Mason, BBC News, Westminster.
Boris Johnson has faced the highest number of ministerial resignations in 24 hours in British political history. That gives you an idea of the scale of the loss of support. 1 in 5 of all those Conservative MPs who held ministerial jobs or other official posts have now resigned. Here are their names. All of them resigning since Sajid Javid, former Health Secretary, was the first to quit about this time yesterday. They include one other Cabinet Minister, of course, Rishi Sunak, who resigned as Chancellor, ministers and a number of ministerial aides. Our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, looks at what's driving the discontent within the Conservative Party and what might happen next.
Time to speak out. Dozens of Conservative ministers and MPs have had enough. Some have been critical for months. Others stayed loyal to Boris Johnson, but not anymore.
I've never done this before. It is not in my nature to go on about Prime Minister. I challenge the government policy rather than personalities, but I just think we've reached an end point.
We are just constantly going from one crisis to another under this leadership and a reluctance to accept where those problems came from, and we've got to concentrate on these issues that are really affecting people. This charade has to stop.
I feel for the Prime Minister, I really do. I like the man, I've got a huge amount of respect for the man, but I cannot let this pass.
As support drained away, the Prime Minister's closest allies tried their best to fight his corner.
My message to colleagues is calm down. Calm down.
Really? Are they overreacting in your view? Even
be very
though...
careful where we go here.
Why?
Be very careful about bringing down a Prime Minister who won a very personal mandate from the British people in 2019.
Liam Fox has stayed loyal to every Conservative leader since he was first elected in 1992. But he told me Mr Johnson has squandered too many second chances.
The way things have been handled, the way that lines constantly change, the way that ministers therefore can't with any confidence repeat the line that they're being given. I think all of this incrementally damages credibility so much that it's difficult to lead. And I hope that for his own sake, but for the sake of the Conservative Party, the government, and most importantly the country, he goes quickly.
Prime Ministers rarely get to choose how they leave office. Margaret Thatcher promised to fight on, but her cabinet told her it was time to go. John Major survived rebellions, staggered to an election and was beaten in a landslide. David Cameron recognised that losing the EU referendum was a resigning matter. Theresa May won a vote of confidence, but left a few months later.
It's obviously incredibly tough on them personally. These things normally build up over a long period of time. But I think most people who've done the job get to a point where they recognise that time's up and that it's not actually in their own interest in terms of their legacy or their party's interest or the country's interest for them to carry on.
I can announce that the Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
This group of MPs could have a crucial role to play if Boris Johnson refuses to leave. The 1922 committee could organise another vote of confidence. Boris Johnson won the Conservatives their biggest election victory in more than 30 years. Many MPs backed him because they wanted to make sure Brexit happened. But he hasn't been able to translate that success on the campaign trail into government. And many in his own party have now turned against him, fearing he was tarnishing their reputation as well as his own. He can drag out his departure, but few think Boris Johnson has got long left in number 10. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
Now, before we go on to our next report, let me take you live to Downing Street. And this is what's happening there, number 10. As far as we know, those cabinet ministers are still in number 10, talking to the Prime Minister with, as we say, offering him one message: it's time to go. The other thing to note, by the way, is that the chairman of the influential 1922 Backbench Committee, that's a committee of Tory MPs, Sir Graham Brady, well, he's apparently gone to see the Prime Minister to offer what reports are calling wise counsel. So that is the latest in Downing Street, where it's all happening tonight, the future of the Prime Minister being decided. Well, all that is a world away from what was happening just 2.5 years ago, when Boris Johnson won a thumping election victory, giving him an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons. That victory, including those gains in former Labour strongholds, meant he enjoyed the support of the overwhelming majority of Tory MPs. But today, as we've seen, that has all changed. All day, letters of resignation have been pouring in. Backbenchers too have withdrawn their support. We've been analysing their letters and the words they've chosen. These are the most common words used. Some keep recurring, like government and country. But take a closer look and you get a sense of what's really worrying these Tory MPs. Words like values and integrity just down here. So that's what politicians feel. But what about Tory supporters? Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth reports from Wiltshire.
Summer in Salisbury and things might seem serene. This city's in the heart of Wiltshire, fairly solid Tory turf. The party holds all 7 parliamentary seats. But at this local bistro, 4 Conservatives from across the county have been watching closely as the tension unfurls in Westminster.
Personally, I'm very disappointed, and so are the members as well. Last night I was talking to quite a few residents, and they were stalwart. They're Boris supporters. They didn't mind. A lot of people didn't mind he'd had a beer or done something like that. But this, being lied to, this is a totally different game.
Here, they say Downing Street's response to allegations about the Deputy Chief Whip was the final straw in a longer line of events that's led them to question the party's leadership.
I think what has happened recently has been a kind of final moral and emotional trigger for people to say enough is enough. Any MPs who continue to support him are complicit in bringing the Conservative Party into disrepute.
Whatever electoral appeal he did have, and we can't forget that he did deliver Brexit, whatever your views on that are, but quite frankly he's had his day. The feedback I get from residents, it's very much, we can't continue to support the Conservatives. So it's a really, dark time for the party, but I'm hoping that if we do see a change, then that will at least give us some credibility back.
These are a snapshot of views from the Tory Southern Heartlands, but Richard, County Council leader and party member for more than 25 years, says he's heard similar from colleagues more widely.
The feel was that the lack of honesty was just eroding everyone's confidence, and that in itself, it was too corrosive. It wasn't some sort of Remainer plot. It was people saying, I'm sorry, character is just not there.
What a different picture just 2.5 years ago. Boris Johnson on the campaign trail here before he swept to election victory. Even now, some agree he does still have a public mandate.
I like him. I know a lot of people don't, but I don't want him to go.
I was, for him, but at the moment I'm just not sure.
I can't see anybody else that could look after the country like Boris has.
But even in this Tory territory, there's wavering. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Wiltshire.
And our political editor, Chris Mason, joins us now. Chris, when history tells us that when cabinet ministers stream into number 10, usually there's only one real outcome.
Quite, and that's exactly what we're witnessing, George, right now. And not just that, but as you mentioned a few moments ago, Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the backbench group of Conservative MPs known as the 1922 Committee, heading into Downing Street in just the last couple of minutes, offering, we are told, wise counsel, which is Westminster speak for Sir Graham telling the Prime Minister, the time is up, you've lost the party, you've got to go. In Downing Street right now are 2 groups of senior ministers. There are those who are going in there to say just that to Boris Johnson, that he should resign. There are others who are saying no, reflecting those voices we heard from Alex Forsyth there, saying no, you have a mandate from the last general election. A new Prime Minister would not have that mandate. It may bring forward a general election sooner rather than later. So they are the arguments going on right now at the heart of government, which will shape what Boris Johnson chooses to do next. There are some here pondering that as soon as this evening, Mr Johnson may decide to resign. Were he not to do that, some of those ministers who want him to may resign themselves, and as soon as next week, you could see a move from backbenchers to try and remove him via a vote of confidence. Things are very fluid, but this day could have quite a few hours left in it yet.
Chris, thank you. And as Chris was saying, things are very fluid, so we'll be back with him whenever we need to in this fast-moving story. Now, former Chancellor Rishi Sunak's shock resignation letter revealed that he and Boris Johnson fundamentally disagreed on the handling of the economy. His successor, Nadhim Zahawi, may be closer in ideology to the Prime Minister, having said nothing is off the table in terms of cutting taxes. But what economic situation has he inherited? Well, our economics editor, Faisal Islam, is here to explain. Faisal.
Yes, thanks, George. The new Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, has a very difficult in-tray to deal with if he gets the chance. First up, the economy is slowing, possibly to a halt and plausibly into a recession, as the OECD and others have forecast recently the slowest of the major economies next year. The Chancellor acknowledged this challenge this morning, perhaps a hint of action, some sort of temporary stimulus. The problem is, of course, the rate of price rises. Inflation at a 40-year high, and not just heading higher, but again, according to outside forecasters and the Bank of England governor himself, fears that inflation here in the UK will remain more stubborn, staying higher for longer. Clearly, the principal driver behind that is energy prices, and we've been shown an energy industry calculation that bills under the energy price cap for an average household this winter will top £3,000 a year for all types: direct debit, payments on the entire bill, and prepayment meters. By the way, that would be the equivalent of a typical £50 top-up, lasting just 4 days. This, though, is before the government's cost of living support. This morning, there was a leap in the point at which national insurance begins to be paid. Now not until £12,500 of earnings. Certainly a significant effective tax cut on its own, worth about £300 for millions of households. However, this comes just 3 months after a much bigger NI rise and a freezing of income tax thresholds that has seen millions of taxpayers pushed into paying higher tax rates. The mood music from the Chancellor this morning was that nothing was off the table and he would review major tax and spending decisions. Here are some of the options, from fast-tracking a planned income tax cut, an emergency VAT cut, cancelling some of the planned rise in business taxes, and more direct cost of living support over the next year. But would that mean more borrowing? Former Chancellor Rishi Sunak felt the PM should level with Britain about tough times and that extra government borrowing risked making inflation worse. The PM, if he survives, or even to survive, might be tempted to alter course on that. George.
Faisal, thank you very much. And the time is just gone 22 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. The Prime Minister's authority is draining away, resignation after resignation from government, and a loss of support among his backbenchers too. And coming up, Nick Kyrgios storms through to the men's singles semi-finals at Wimbledon in straight sets against Chile's Christian Garin.
And stay with us on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
One of the biggest war crimes investigations in modern times is underway in Ukraine. The International Criminal Court and national prosecutors are gathering evidence of Russian atrocities. Some of the worst took place in Bucha, a suburb of the capital Kyiv. More than 1,000 people are understood to have died during the month-long Russian occupation of towns in the region. And as our special correspondent Fergal Keane reports, there is psychological devastation for the families of the dead. And a warning, you may find some of this report distressing.
She's come to gather in what's left of the life of a lost son. A man who loved laughter. Denis Rudenko, killed in a massacre. His mother Katerina has come to clear out Denis's locker at the garage where he worked.
Его любимая куртка. Шапочка его любимая. Моя дитятка.
Denis was 37, a father of two. He was shot dead by the Russians with 7 other men on March 4th last at 144 Jablonska Street in Bucha. It began with ambushes. Ukrainian artillery stalled the Russian advance. The Russians encountered resistance here as they tried to break through to Kiev that they simply hadn't expected. So what they did was to launch a sweep right through the area, going house to house to find anyone they suspected of helping the Ukrainians. They arrested Denis Rudenko, seen here in the blue sweater, with 8 other men. There was torture, then execution, beside the Russian base. His mother didn't see Denis again until she saw his body in a mortuary a month later.
Тіло під номером 316. Це був Денис.
Body number 316. It was Denis.
З чоловіком дивилися, але я
My husband. And I looked at it, but I didn't understand at first what the holes were.
Стегно було прострелене.
He was shot, and his thigh was shot through. And if I'm not mistaken, there were shots in his abdomen and his eye.
There are still plenty traces of the Russians at 144 Jablonska, obscene graffiti on the walls. A soldier's military debit card we found in the rubbish. Old ration packs in what's now a crime scene.
At the place of the execution, all bodies were lying here in different positions.
And the man leading Ukraine's investigation told us he's going after President Putin and his elite.
That's where the bullet hit.
It was definitely planned in advance. It was instructed from the top. The suspects would be top of the top, so the guys who actually launched the war, let's say.
Putin, his defense minister, all of
Yeah.
this.
So it's like a chain of people which decisions led to the invasion to Ukraine.
Russia says the massacre was a fake, its standard response to even the most glaring truths. And the Kremlin isn't cowed by war crimes investigations. It'll be hard to get justice for Denis Rudenko while Vladimir Putin remains in power.
Щоб не сталося потім, мені якось байдуже.
Whatever will happen later, after the war ends,
Мене просто нема сина.
I don't care at all. Honestly,
Щоб не сталося потім.
I simply have no son.
Самого любимого, самого родного чоловічка.
My dearest, my most beloved person.
Він в мене такий ангелочок був.
He cared for me so much. He was such an angel.
Він настільки беріг мене.
Justice may or may not come, but the dead will stay dead. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Jablonska Street.
British Airways has announced it will cut a further 10,300 short-haul flights until the end of October. It's the latest wave of cancellations to hit the aviation industry ahead of the summer holidays. Our transport correspondent Katie Austin is with me. So what are the implications of these latest cuts for passengers, for holidaymakers?
Well, these cancellations involve flights to and from Heathrow, Gatwick and London's City Airport over August, September and October. And I understand it brings the total number of flights British Airways has now removed from its April to October schedules to nearly 30,000. Now, a lot of aviation businesses are struggling with staff shortages right now, just as passengers return. And we have seen disruption at airports and we've seen airlines cancelling flights as well. This latest wave of advance cancellations by BA comes after the UK government gave airlines a short window to hand back flight slots they weren't going to be able to use anymore without the usual penalty. The point of that is actually to make schedules more resilient, to reduce the chances of summer disruption on the day, like last-minute cancellations. And British Airways says it's consolidating some of its quieter services to protect as many holiday flights as possible, and it says it's contacting customers about rebooking options or to give them a refund.
All right, Katie, thank you very much. To sport now, the Women's Euros kick off this evening. England is hosting and the Lionesses are among the favourites. They take on Austria in front of 70,000 fans at Old Trafford tonight. Northern Ireland will be making their debut in the tournament, which has been delayed by a year because of the pandemic. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks has this report.
Manchester weather might not have cottoned on, but this is the start of a summer of sport. A summer where fans believe England's women will become household names and the game will change forever.
I just really want to be a footballer, and watching these girls play is just really inspiring me.
The world is going to be watching England. The world is going to be watching women's football, and a full stadium and one of the best stadiums in the world, and we'll be there to see it.
I feel like if the women win, it'll be so much better because people can see what women can do and not just the men.
Old Trafford is a sellout tonight, as are all of England's games. And far from being fearful, the players are relishing the spotlight on the women's game.
We know what to expect and we're ready for it. But yeah, I think everybody's got their own things in place now to be able to deal with it. And, you know, pressure's a privilege. So it's something that we're embracing.
England are one of the favourites for this tournament, but the fact remains Bobby Moore is the last captain to have lifted a major trophy for England. The men made it all the way to the final here last summer. Can the Lionesses go one better and win it?
It's something they've never managed before.
Chance for six. Six scored by Germany.
When they last made the final in 2009, they were hammered by Germany. Since then, they've fallen at the semi-finals hurdle at the last three major tournaments. Chelsea's Fran Kirby had a front row seat for all three and doesn't fancy a repeat.
It takes a long time to get over it when you unfortunately don't get there, but yeah, I think you just got to use it as motivation. It's definitely my motivation. I don't want to feel the way I did, you know, losing them semi-finals, so hopefully we can do one better and get to the final this time.
Dutch manager Sarina Wiegman took the reins of the Lionesses last September to much acclaim, and she's backing up the hype. 14 matches, no defeats, 12 wins.
30 yards across the deck, Grunnen's crossing the far stick, Miedema's there, chance, it's in!
She coached the reigning champions Netherlands to glory in 2017, but this is different.
Everything is more, bigger, more expectations, higher expectations. The level of the game is higher, so actually it's hard to compare.
Domestic match attendance is where the women's game needs improvement, but a record 500,000 tickets have been sold for these Euros. England know, though, if they want to win hearts, they must first win matches.
Chance for England, Kirby 1-0!
Natalie Perks, BBC News.
And our sports editor Dan Rowan joins us now from Old Trafford. Dan, a big day for the Lionesses, but arguably a bigger day for women's football.
I think women's sports more generally, George, yes. I mean, this is being seen by many as the single biggest women's sports event ever held in Europe, let alone here in England. There's no doubt that there's been huge strides made by women's football since the last Euros were held here in 2005, a fully professional domestic league that now attracts some of the world's best players, landmark broadcast deals, investment and sponsorship, a thriving grassroots scene as well, one of the fastest growing sports in the UK, girls football. And yet despite that, there is also a sense there's a long way to go, especially when it comes to attendances in the domestic league, which the FA are desperate to increase. To do that, they know that this is an opportunity that must be seized, and I think there is a feeling that that can be especially the case if England go all the way, and there's no doubt they are genuine contenders. You can watch their bid to win a first major tournament as it starts this evening on BBC One Live from 7:10 with this opener against Austria. Even in this crowded sporting summer, George, there is a feeling that this is arguably the most important event of all because of the impact it can have, a chance to turbo boost the women's game to a level it hasn't yet enjoyed.
Dan, thank you very much. Wimbledon now, and Nick Kyrgios is through to the semi-finals of a Grand Slam for the first time after a straight sets win over Chile's Christian Garin. Earlier, Simona Halep won her quarter-final match against the American Amanda Anisimova. Our sports correspondent Joe Wilson has been watching the action.
Anyone can be a champion at Wimbledon, or at least pose like one. It's a nice photo opportunity. But the real tournament for the women almost feels open to anyone. Romania's Simona Halep is the only player left in the singles draw who's won a Grand Slam before, and at 30, this is her revival time. She said she was super close to retirement recently, hampered by leg injury. Well, look at Halep go now. Tough for her opponent, Amanda Anisimova, just 20, a young American who's been through a lot in her life. You can seem very exposed on centre court. Well, be reassured that she recovered to 6-4 in the second set, but it was Halep's match. In the semi-final, she'll play Elena Rybakina of Kazakhstan. It's the furthest she's ever got in a Grand Slam. Well, let's take you to court 2, to the number 1 seeds in the men's doubles, and a very close call. It was out, or was it? Hang on. Hawkeye camera said the ball was in, just. The reaction from Britain's Joe Salisbury and American Rajiv Ram was a version of, "You cannot be serious."
No way, man! Are you going to turn it off? Yeah, I mean, that's ridiculous. I'm not starting again until you turn it off.
Well, they lost faith in the Hawkeye system, but it wasn't turned off and they did start again. And in the 5th set, Joe Salisbury hit the winning shot. They're into the semi-finals. Who do you think they came to point at? Clue, he's wearing a cap back to front. There may be stories to come about Nick Kyrgios on court today. He took control of his quarter-final against Chile's Christian Garin and was mostly in control of himself. Well, he had moments. But he did it in straight sets. For the first time, Kyrgios is in a Grand Slam semi-final. On centre court, the man with 22 Grand Slam titles was looking vulnerable. Rafael Nadal needed medical attention. He needed to dig deep against American Taylor Fritz. But the crowd may have willed it. But Fritz, the 11th seed, had his own ideas.
We are marvelling, though, at the resilience of Rafael Nadal. 36 years young now. He's just taken the 4th set, so they're into a 5th set in their quarter-final. George, it reminds you a little bit of last night, doesn't it? As for Cameron Norrie, well, so much going on today. He's just been able to relax and recover.
Joe, thank you very much. And back to our main story tonight, Boris Johnson's leadership. How are voters reacting to the events of the last 24 hours? The constituency of High Peak in Derbyshire swung to the Conservatives from Labour at the last election. Our correspondent Judith Moritz has been talking to people there.
200 miles from Westminster, Whaley Bridge feels far removed. But you don't have to look too far for ominous symbolism or for signs which could represent how locals are feeling. At the end of Johnson Street sits the Builders Merchants, where they say they put a price on honesty.
It'd be a lot cheaper than what we did yesterday, but I'll find out and I'll confirm the price to you.
And where views are changing.
I felt sorry for him in a way, because he's had a lot of pressure, what with COVID, and then we're coming into the Ukraine war, which he's trying to sort that out. And then there's all the Partygate, which I'm not sure about, but there's just too many lies coming out of his mouth. And after the 2 head ministers resigned yesterday, I thought it is time now. If they haven't got confidence in Boris, then he does need to go.
People here know how it feels when things are precarious. The PM visited them in 2019 when the town was evacuated because a nearby dam threatened to burst.
There is plenty of support here for Conservative ideology, but the local MP only holds this seat by the slimmest of majorities, 590 votes. And so come a general election, what's going on at Westminster could make a real difference to this constituency.
Issues like the cost of living are an obvious priority, but personality politics matter too, according to 18-year-old Gemma.
So you're studying politics. What do you make of the professionals, of how the government are handling things?
They're not being great role models, in all fairness. We need someone there to be in charge and have that expertise and show us, guide us the way. They're meant to be the people with the knowledge who are meant to guide us, but they're just not.
Oh, it matters to me a hell of a lot.
Outside, I found Colin, whose loyalty is wavering. Did you vote Conservative? Are you a supporter of the Tories?
I've been a Conservative all my life, since 1960-odd. And there's one thing I always believed in, and that is honesty. If you're not honest, the public will not have you.
The town's no longer under threat from the reservoir dam, but whether the government has a bright future here is another matter. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Whaley Bridge.
Now, tonight, the Prime Minister is in Downing Street with his cabinet ministers on one of the most extraordinary days in UK politics, with no fewer than 38 members of the government resigning. Let's take you live now to Downing Street. All eyes on the comings and goings there this evening. That figure of 38, by the way, is 2 more resignations than when we started this programme. I said it was fast moving, so let's get the latest now with our political editor Chris Mason, who's in Westminster for us. Chris, I also mentioned the fact that Sir Graham Brady was heading to Downing Street. He's chair of the 1922 committee. I wonder if you'd just explain to our viewers why that is so significant.
It's so important, that, George, because he is the keeper of the letters. In other words, he collates the opinion of Conservative backbenchers to work out whether or not a Prime Minister should